It's a MAGA episode. They've even, just to show the depth and degree of their fealty to their orange-hued tyrant leader, Cyrus Trump, they were seriously broaching Trump himself as the speaker. Their role within the division of labor of the fascist project in this country is to wreck things and to tear shit up. They're not anarchists, but they're part of the project of creating space for Trump to come back in and not to just take down the administrative state, nor to take down the quote unquote, the so-called deep state, but to take it over. This fucking guy, this fascist leader, instigated a physical assault on this very body. The Congress on January 6, 2021, in an attempt to physically block the peaceful transfer of power. This sleepwalking that we're doing, and it's thinking we're all okay because the normal rule of law and electoral institutions will save us, is pretty dangerous thinking right now.
Welcome to episode 174 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes, analyzes, and stands against the very real danger and threat of fascism coming to power in the United States. On a week like this, where there is just so much to talk about, from the unprecedented ouster of Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House to Trump escalating the language of violence and retribution as his trials have begun, and much more as MAGA advances to crush any opposition and moves to attempt to re-seize power, I am so glad to get to chat with fellow Refuse Fascism Editorial Board member, frequent guest of the show, historian, author, and my friend, Paul Street, to unpack and make sense of this all. But first, thanks to everyone who goes the extra step and rates and reviews the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. As proof that we read them all, here is a comment from Brian posted on Podbean. He wrote, "The fascists who over recent years and decades have excitedly amassed themselves over a glorified shared vision of a great destruction of all things that are, to a grand supranationalist renewal that only exists in their imagination, are playing a fantasy death game with the lives of everyone. Far, far worse than merely infantile minds, they strive toward their imposed Armageddon reality, like motherfucking goose-stepping with immeasurable suffering and blood in that wake." Thanks, Brian, for writing to us with your thoughts. And if you appreciate the show and want to help us reach more people who want to refuse fascism in the name of humanity, be a hero, go write a review and drop 5 stars wherever you listen to your pods. Tell the good folks out there in podcast land why you listen, and they should too. Subscribe, follow, so you never miss an episode. And of course, keep up all that great commenting, sharing on social media and the YouTubes. And I want to give thanks to our patrons and show sustainers. We seriously could not do this without you. Become a patron for as little as $2 a month. I mean, can you get coffee that cheap anymore? I don't think so. Go over to patreon.com/refusefascism. With all that business out of the way, I want to welcome Paul back onto the Refuse Fascism podcast to help us make sense of this fascist madness from the past week. Hey, Paul, what's happening?
How you doing? I'm here in Chicago. It's a beautiful fall day, even as the world descends into terror.
I want to just start our chat today with the unprecedented ouster of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. No speaker in U.S. history has ever been removed by a quote-unquote motion to vacate vote. What is going on here? What does this signify? What are the implications? Walk us through this.
You know, I think in a way, Boehner probably quit before he might have been removed. And I think that may have been the case with another recent Republican speaker. It's kind of like, say that Trump was the first person impeached since Andrew Johnson, and in a way, in a de facto kind of way, Nixon was, because he would have been impeached if he gotten out of there. But yeah, they actually carried out this really bizarre parliamentary maneuver that McCarthy had agreed to as the price of getting in to the speakership, which he was just really hungry to have that title on his name. And he agreed to a deal where at any time, any individual member of the House, including the most far-right fascist MAGA maniacs in the Republican caucus, could call a vote, and chickens came home to roost, and it happened because they wanted to pay back for his unpardonable sin of agreeing for a 45-day suspension in the Republic fascist assault on the dead. It's a MAGA episode. From everything we can tell, this was very much in consultation with and at the behest of the great leader, the great orange malignant rabid dog, Donald Trump. And by all indications, the front runner to get the new job is another arch-Trumpist, a running dog lackey of the Donald, and that is Jim Jordan. The media narratives on it are sort of very deceptive because they make it sound like the MAGA aspect of the House is just these 8 or 10 or whatever number of folks around Matt Gaetz, when really the House Republican caucus is MAGA, what we would call Republic fascist, for just about all but 12 to 15 holdouts that some Democrats are dreaming of being able to collaborate with, and those are disproportionately Republicans in districts that supported Biden. The bigger caucus is full of people who voted for Trump's election lie even after January 6th, and Jim Jordan certainly voted for Trump's election lie after January 6th. None of the serious GOP presidential candidates, and this applies then to the whole party, except, a tiny few that don't have a chance, but none of the serious contenders will ever say one thing serious about January 6th or about the extremism and fascism of Trump. This thing wasn't really about the deficit, and we're going to replay this now, and we don't know what's going to happen in 45 days. This thing about crashing the government, which is not about reining in spending. These people supported Trump's huge deficit fueling budget deficits because he was their dear leader, because he was their white Christian, white nationalist Cyrus, their fascist leader. And they signed on to him all the time. They won't sign on to him against Biden because they want to delegitimize Biden. They want to make Biden look bad. They want to make it look like he can't control the government. So to help get their dear leader back in. So it never really actually was about that. And they supported a huge tax cut under Trump, which is a huge driver of the deficit that they claim to be so, concerned about. They've even, just to show the depth and degree of their fealty to their orange-hued tyrant leader, Cyrus Trump, they were seriously broaching the caucus around Gaetz. Trump himself as the speaker. The speaker job is too detailed for a guy like Trump. I can't see him doing it. And I expected him to embrace Jordan, and that's exactly what it did. But I think he's still going to come to the House next week and make a public appearance to rally the right wing, I guess, for Jordan, who he's now formally endorsed. And I mean, that's an extraordinary moment. This fucking guy, this fascist leader, instigated a physical assault on this very body, the Congress, on January 6th, 2021, in an attempt to physically block the peaceful transfer of power after he lost the election. And in fact, he was pissed off that the metal detectors were kept up to prevent the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters and the Proud Boys and other fascists from bringing AR-15s to the Capitol. He wanted an armed assault on the Capitol. I find it just absolutely extraordinary. Now, the MAGA Republicans, which in reality are much bigger than just the 8 to 10 people around Gaetz, are functioning in essence as a wrecking crew. They're constantly treated as buffoons that are just completely out of it in the media, but actually they have a very specific and fascistic mission. Their role within the division of labor of the fascist project in this country is to wreck things and to tear shit up. They're not anarchists, but they're part of the project of creating space for Trump to come back in and not to just take down the administrative state, nor to take down the quote unquote, the so-called deep state, but to take it over and to completely refashion it and to consolidate a Christian white nationalist neo-fascist takeover of this country. And if you look in states where the Republican Party has full control, you see the positive fascist, Republic fascist agenda in full play, that where they have the governor's office. In places like Iowa, places like Florida, places like Missouri, and you just fill in the blank. That's exactly what they're doing. They're remaking. They're trying to create a new type of darkly revanchist, ultra-reactionary governance order in those states. And that's the goal ultimately nationally for this party. And it's not just 8 to 10 people around Matt Gaetz and Lynn Boebert or whatever the hell her name is.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Paul, because I do agree that that is something that has been the media narrative that people are are delivered is this. I think the Washington Post did it most acutely, but the notion of this being a fringe section of the party, I think they called it the party's ideological fringe. And I think that it's really important, as you were saying, that there is an argument, but it's really, let's be clear, McCarthy was no moderate either. There's an argument, there's a tension over methods and the centrality of their role to amplify the undisputed leader of the Republican Fascist Party, which is Trump. It is this group that is not the minority, as much as people would like it to be, that is setting the tone and tenor for politics across this nation. It is the MAGA movement and Trump at its center that are shaping politics, that are setting the terms, which is why this appeasement that McCarthy attempted failed so miserably. If they're continued to call a fringe, or that this is a fringe movement, or that they're not the majority, or that it's just a section, we are continuing to minimize the threat.
There's this just ongoing continuing myth that somehow there are a significant number and ballast of rational, normal functioning parliamentary voices to be found in the Republican Party, and just focusing on Gates and a small handful was a way of obscuring this and essentially normalizing a party that's behind January 6th, and a party that even insofar as some of its members in Congress have a lot of personal, private distaste about Trump, they're so goddamn scared of the power of the 74 million Trumpists in the country and the Trumpist base, which is beholden to Trump, but which also gets its news from right-wing outlets and from Fox News, which had a host recently who is saying, in essence, that we can't rely on elections anymore. It looks like we need a fascist takeover, a revolution. And, and this is what they listen to. This is
Greg, what's his name?
Gonderfeld or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that what you were saying about Trump, I saw an interview where he was saying that he told McCarthy that if he didn't shut down the government and make it a problem for Biden, that he could lose his speakership. This normalization of that kind of threat. I think that there is a difference between the analysis that you were bringing forward about the role of this wrecking ball, if you will, because a lot of the media has kind of painted it as like chaos for chaos sake. These are just agents of chaos.
Just nihilistic anarchists with no real ideological vision.
Right, that they just want to wreck things, whereas you're talking about what the wrecking serves. There was this article in the Philly Inquirer by Will Bunch about the Red Caesar aspect, which I think is actually what the Greg guy was talking about. The idea that they would, quote unquote, suspend democracy, that they're seeing this as a crisis where, as he put it, quote, the alleged brain trust of an increasingly fascist MAGA movement wants an American dictatorship that would, quote unquote, suspend democracy in January 2025, just 15 months from now, end quote.
Absolutely.
And creating such a situation where people feel like, oh, there needs to be Trump back in power in order to calm the chaos. I think that this is a moment where people are having to look at, why do they need to? Why are they trying to blow up the normal operations of this political rule of this system? As you were pointing to, that it's to get this anti-woman, anti-immigrant, anti-science, anti-LGBTQ, anti-humanity program into place.
It's covered by this kind of illusion of it sort of is meant to deceptively, I think, bring in libertarian sentiments and to bring in populist sentiments, that we're trying to crash this deep state that is beholden to a globalist elite. Maybe I'm repeating myself here, but they don't want to crash it. And anyone who wants to understand how ambitious and bold their vision is for the future they want to create can look at Agenda 47, a link on the Trump website. And it's just an elaborate, detailed plan for the takeover of one part of the federal government after another, and the replacement of normal civil service operatives with thousands of staff members whose sole criterion for presence in the federal government is ideological fealty to the Christian white nationalist agenda. Or look at the Heritage Foundation's Project 25 mandate for leadership. It's only 900 pages. And it's, again, this very detailed. Trump this time is different than 2016. He is bringing along hundreds and hundreds, an army of far right-wing so-called conservative, because we can't say fascist, conservative so-called actually radical right-wing policy wonks and policy operatives with very ambitious plans about expanding executive authority to an unprecedented level in this country and really fundamentally changing the very governance of this society on far-right authoritarian lines. So it's not anarchist at all. It's not libertarian at all. And it's not particularly populist because they won't go after the rich, actually. Trump loves the rich. Fascism loves the rich. There's a book out about Hitler's billionaires and how well they did under fascism.
I wanted to move the conversation to Trump's trial, his latest threats, and the deafening silence of so many people and so much of the media, so clearly trying to just wish him and his million-strong movement away. Recently, he claimed migrants are poisoning the blood of this country. He threatened to deport anyone who he deems a communist or Marxist. He said that the outgoing Mark Milley deserved death. He, in a recent speech, talked about shooting shoplifters, killing them. And this was just his latest in his mortal threats against his political enemies and opponents. And some of what I said was just the tip of the iceberg. And I want to get into kind of what he has been saying and the role that this violent rhetoric plays. You know, to me, it's clear that the splits are growing more intense and the language of political violence is at a fever pitch. There's just real, frightening levels to me of normalization at the same time that there's this escalating. And in your recent piece on your Substack, you had said, quote, "This is Trump's core campaign promise, fascistic vengeance." And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what you've been noticing in his language.
Well, it was just
violence.
astonishing that it was just incredible and depressing that we still had to argue within the intellectual class about whether Trump was actually a fascist. Even after January 6th, the argument still continued. The extent and the degree of the denial is just mind-boggling. And I've got a chapter in my book, This Happened Here, Amerikaners, Neoliberals, and the Trumping of America, titled The Anatomy of Fascism Denial. But if you want any more proof in the pudding, listen to post-January 6th Trump and Trump over the last years, and particularly Trump this year, and particularly in recent months. Here's one that is an interesting example of what we're talking about and then it being underplayed in the media. Trump recently, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, went gun shopping to demonstrate his fealty to the Second Amendment and the holy right to bear arms in this country and the NRA and all of that. But he didn't go to just any gun shop. He went to the Palmetto State Armory in South Carolina, which was the same gun store that sold the racist killer who bought 2 guns there to then go to Jacksonville, Florida, and shoot 3 black people dead in a predominantly black neighborhood in that city of Jacksonville, Florida. At least one of the weapons that he purchased, this killer, was painted with a swastika. So of all the 16,700 and whatever gun stores in America to do this, Trump went to that particular place. And I guarantee you that wasn't just by accident. The comment that he made recently in speaking to the GOP convention in California about how if you rob a store, you ought to get shot, essentially amounts to an endorsement of extrajudicial executions of suspected shoplifters, right? And it's very reminiscent of something he said during the George Floyd rebellion, where he recycled a quote from the racist Miami mayor in 1967, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. So not new. Also in that same California convention of the California GOP, he made a quip about Paul Pelosi, who was gravely attacked. He had to have skull surgery, and he was attacked by one of Trump's maniacal supporters who believed the many Hitlerian lies about a stolen election right now. And so he made a quip. He said, well, something like, how's Paul Pelosi doing anyway? Does anybody know? And that was chilling enough. But what was even more chilling was the hundreds of California Republicans who roared their laughter and roared their applause and cheered. Of course, there was the comment about maybe Mike Milley, the former chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, deserves execution for just reassuring his Chinese counterpart in the waning days of the Trump administration that the maniacal Donald wasn't going to attack them in an attempt to make sure that the transition didn't involve World War III. Yes, he has called this year for invading Mexico. And by the way, the other GOP presidential candidates all seem to be on board with that. Alvin Bragg, the New York prosecutor who is in charge of the Stormy Daniels case earlier this year when Bragg's indictments came down. But by the way, not just Bragg, but voted on by a grand jury of like New York citizens. Trump posted a picture of him with a baseball bat aimed at Bragg's head. He's told people to go after, that's the actual quote, Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, who's been prosecuting him in the civil case on his fraudulent business practices in the state of New York. Deport Marxists. The context of that, he was talking to Ralph Reed's Christian fascist group, and he was saying, we already have a law, it goes back to World War I, that prevents, technically, says communists can't come into this country from other countries. They can't migrate in. And then he says, but maybe I think we ought to think about our own homegrown Marxists and socialists. And when he has accused MSNBC and its parent network, NBC, of treason, because they've had unfavorable coverage from him. The repeated comment that he makes that I think is very telling in his campaign rallies, which are really hate rallies. He says, I will be your retribution, your retribution. That's a very violent word. It means vengeance. It means payback. When Michael Reinhold was on the run and was killed by a Trumpist federal fugitive task force in the late summer of 2020 in the Northwest outside Portland. Michael Reinhold had, under circumstances that aren't completely clear, killed a fascist street thug. I'm not embracing violence in Portland during all the Black Lives protests there. He was on the run and a fugitive task force was sent to get him and killed him without questioning him. It was essentially an extrajudicial assassination, really. And Trump's comment on it was his retribution. Retribution. I mean, it's a very powerful word, and he used it. As David Remnick said in the New Yorker recently, these are Trump's bloody campaign promises, and they're very consistent with the Trump administration. None of this should be taken lightly at all. This is not just bloviating. This is a guy who wanted the Department of Defense to send the troops to crush the George Floyd rebellion bloodily in the streets. He said to his defense secretary at the time, a guy named Esper, he said, can't we just shoot him? Can't we just at least just shoot him in the legs? I don't know. A lot of liberals and moderates just seem to be sleepwalking about all of this. There's the normal electoral thing where we're all conditioned to think that our politics only matters and we can do anything for those 2 minutes in voting booths every 4 years. But I think it's reinforced too by all the trials. How many? There's 91 indictments against Trump, plus the civil trials over rape and the civil trials over fraudulent business practices. And so he's in court so much. It's just reinforcing this sense that the system is working and it's taking care of him. Guess what, folks? He's the runaway GOP nominee. Nobody's coming close. It seems almost completely inevitable he's going to be their nominee. He's running ahead of Biden, or at least matched up with him in all the matchup polls. A year before, Biden's popularity levels are in the death zone. His approval numbers are in the 30s. The year before the presidential election, that is typically a death knell. That's Jimmy Carter territory. And a tie under the American Electoral College system goes to the Republican, because the Electoral College which is an archaic institution, which goes back to the slave owners' constitution from the late 18th century. A tie goes to the Republican. So this guy right now, the betting money is he could get in there. He could get in there and kill the federal prosecutions against him. Some people still cling to he can't pardon himself out of the state prosecution in Georgia. If this guy gets elected to the White House and he's president, he would easily and clearly nullify. There's just no way in hell the Supreme Court would let the state of Georgia is going to deploy their own National Guard and send them up to D.C. and take out President Donald Trump and bring him to a Georgia prison. I don't think so. It's not going to happen. This sleepwalking that we're doing, and it's thinking we're all okay because the normal rule of law and electoral institutions will save us, it's pretty dangerous thinking right now. And people better start thinking another way. And they better start thinking about what the hell they're going to do when this guy gets elected again and what our resistance is going to look like. And we better start building our resistance right now. And it can't just be about elections and lawsuits and criminal prosecutions.
Yeah, especially when he has gone after every judge, every witness. This is not just Trump being Trump, as it so easily gets dismissed by. Well, it is Trump being Trump, but it's not only Trump being Trump. There's a logic to this, and there's a trajectory that it's going on, that wishing it was different, hoping that it goes back to the days before Trump, that America, which was part of bringing Trump to the fore anyway, is incredibly dangerous. And in addition to him remaining the Republican front runner by miles, the fact that he's not banned or prevented from continuing his campaign, he's also backed up and defended by, as you talked about earlier in our conversation, a thoroughly fascist GOP and escalating threats of violence that extend from the top and people in power across state houses across the country, but also a legion of followers who are armed to the teeth and gunning for a civil war. What you're saying, makes a lot of sense, and yet is very different from what people are being told.
The comments about deporting Marxists and all of that, I take that very seriously. I take that somewhat personally. But we would not be the first targets. One of the things fascism does is eliminate the other party that goes after the other party that has any real power. And that means Democrats. And this incitement of political violence is one of the really key and defining aspects of fascist movements and of fascist politics. I think you're absolutely right to mention the gun thing. One of the many reasons to take this shit really seriously, particularly in the U.S. context, is that there are 125 weapons in circulation for every 100 Americans. There is no other country anywhere that comes remotely close to that, and those arms are disproportionately owned by folks on the right. I am so happy that before, and I forgot to mention this, you mentioned the remarkable quote about how Trump recently said, talking to one of the more far-right Christian fascist groups that he cultivates, he said that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our nation. That is one of the most explicitly fascist things that I've heard Trump say. And that's saying a hell of a lot, because he said a whole lot of fascist stuff, but that's extraordinary. Poisoning the blood of our country. That's right out of Mein Kampf. That is blood and soil. I mentioned that in relation to Biden because in the speech that he gave recently in Tempe, Arizona, he went off on this whole American exceptionalist rant about what a great country we are, and we were founded on an idea, never in connection with any notion of blood and soil, which is in many ways just incorrect. But here we are with a living embodiment of the blood and soilism of American manifest destiny, and it's deeply synergistic with fascism. There's a lot in American history that inspired classic historical fascism. And here's Trump saying that kind of stuff. That's an extraordinary comment that he would say that.
I did want to talk a little bit about that speech that you had mentioned, because there are some really intense takes about how that was the best speech that Biden ever delivered. It was the absolute defense of American democracy. And it is Joe Biden that is single-handedly going to stop the fascist threat. There's multiple think pieces on this right now. I feel like there's a lot to unpack. We're not going to do it all today. But no. Biden gave a speech at, let's just say where this speech was. It was at the John McCain Institute in Arizona. Right. He essentially said that Trump threatens U.S. democracy. He called out some of the real awful things that Trump has done and said and represents.
Sure.
And he used that to go straight into talking about if Trump destroys our democracy, then the U.S. won't be able to, quote unquote, lead the world, AKA, in my opinion, act as the top dog imperialist. If the U.S. right. democracy goes down, then other imperialists like China or Russia could have more influence. And I just think that it's really important that we understand that this is their concern with opposing fascism. But your latest piece
sure.
talks about why our concern
sure.
has to come from a different place. And I was wondering if you could talk some about that.
Well, it was a hell of a speech. He just can't express enough love for John McCain, who, along with Joe, in the supposed beacon of the world of the way life should be, the homeland and headquarters of freedom, both Joe and John, great friends going back to the 60s, voted in the fall of 2002 in the U.S. Senate to let George Bush imperialistically and quite undemocratically invade Iraq if George W. Bush wanted to. And guess what? George Bush wanted to, and they did it. And 1 million people died. The speech was just loaded with American exceptionalism. The reference to the United States as the indispensable nation, the beacon to the world, and he pitches our democracy off of our Constitution. Briefly, Biden, when speaking to donors last year, was able to call Trumpism at least semi-fascism. And he won't even do that anymore. Now he just says MAGA Republicans, and he stops there. And even when he said it last year, it was only to elite donors. This notion that we're some sort of great democracy is just utterly preposterous in, I suppose, ways that we've talked about before. There are about 85 different examples I could give you of policy being implemented without any democracy in complete violation of majority opinion. I mean, just bing, bing, bing. You can go down through the issues, and there's just massive empirical research, not just by leftists or Marxists like myself, but by mainstream liberal political scientists like Martin Gillens of Princeton and Benjamin Page of Northwestern. And it's to link our democracy to our Constitution, which is this profoundly authoritarian and anti-democratic institution, including the Electoral College, which is just openly undemocratic, the absurdly powerful and malapportioned Senate, which is just openly anti-democratic, the appointed for life godlike Supreme Court, which is monumentally anti-democratic, states' rights, going back to the slave owner and merchant capitalist gentry origin in this country, the charter drafted by merchant capitalists and planters and publicists for whom democracy was the ultimate nightmare. He's just going on and on about this Constitution. And Biden talks about how terrible it is that Trump is attacking this Constitution when, in fact, Trump is enabled by this Constitution. He's deeply enabled by it. And the minority rule, Republic, fascist, white nationalist movement is over-empowered far beyond its numbers precisely by this Constitution, among other things, but precisely by the Electoral College, precisely by the malapportioned sentiment, precisely by the gerrymandering that is all too allowed under the Constitution, and precisely by this far right-wing Supreme Court, which is advancing the fascist agenda in reproductive rights, in voting rights, in college admissions policies, and more. So there's just this absurdity about it. And wrapped into the whole speech, of course, was Biden's notion that Trump and Trumpism and neo-fascism and what he can't call fascism, what he calls MAGA republicanism, are some sort of wild aberration that have absolutely nothing to do with American history. They're completely outside American history, which is just false. It's just false. The forces of white nationalism, the forces of fundamentalism, the forces of conspiratorialism, the forces of political violence, and all of this stuff that was greatly inspirational to Hitler. Just read Mein Kampf. He named his wartime train, Hitler did, America, because he wanted to mimic the segregation laws and the manifest destiny. And he wanted his eastward expansion from Berlin to Moscow and Leningrad to mimic the American Western expansion from the East Coast, taking over Mexico and all of that. But I think I lost your question, Sam. It was something about how we understand it and oppose it.
Yeah, their concern being maintaining order, including order in terms of world power and dominance, and how we oppose fascism from a very different place. That's spoken to some in your latest piece on Substack. Right. And I was wondering if there was anything on those lines that you wanted to speak to.
Well, so you do see some horror with Trump's latest comments. A really good example of that is Remnick's piece in The New Yorker. Remnick's a very good writer. He's a very sharp guy. And it's titled Trump's Bloody Campaign Promises. And he's right. These are campaign promises, all this shit he's saying right now. This is the future. But then he ends up praising Biden, and it's the limits of liberalism and the liberal worldview. All we can do is we can hope that Biden gets reelected. And he seems to sense some sort of anti-authoritarian aspect to Biden. And what's missing here, and what's missing from a lot of our liberal friends, is any understanding of the systemic and the structural, material, historical underpinnings of why fascism has happened in this country and where it comes from. And if you ask me, to really get down to it, not only did we at Refuse Fascism say voting isn't enough, there was a moment where we realized that the way we wanted them out, which is through mass action in the streets, hadn't happened. We made an effort at that. We tried that. I was in some very impressive marches and mobilizations to remove Trump the way the Puerto Ricans had removed Ricky Rossello, through mass action and destabilization in the street. So I said, okay, this guy's so freaking dangerous, we got to vote him out. because there'll be some breathing room. There'll be some breathing space. Well, he did get voted out. Trump denies it, and tens of millions of Americans, unfortunately, believe him that the election was stolen. And not a whole hell of a lot has happened. Our hope was there would be some breathing space to form the types of social movements that would not have just removed Trump, but have made a whole new political statement to the political class and to the nation to change the terms of politics in this country. You do really right-wing, dangerous, ecocidal crap, we'll shut this place down with a vision beyond. Well, we need a vision beyond normative quadrennial elections and so-called rule of law. And I think that the Biden years are really very instructive and very educational and pedagogically useful in that. We got him voted out, and look where we are right now. Well, fascism doesn't just come from bad voting decisions. Fascism is fundamentally rooted in the nature of the system we're living. Capitalism tends towards it, in my opinion. I think fascism grows out of capitalism, particularly in its later phases of crisis, because capitalism regularly and routinely, by its very authoritarian and power centralizing nature, delegitimizes the very idea of democracy that it cloaks itself with. It regularly trumps majority public opinion on one issue after another. There is this fundamental contradiction between concentrated wealth and power on one hand and one person, one vote, and democracy on the other hand. Louis Brandeis was right? The old Supreme Court justice who said you've got to choose. You can have wealth concentrated in a few hands, or you can have democracy, but you can't have both at the same time. Now, Brandeis was a liberal, so he thought policy could be jiggered in such a way as to stop that concentration of wealth. No, to the concentration of wealth and power, and on a global scale, incidentally, and the imperialism that grows out of that, and the competition between your capitalist country and other country. Those are inherent characteristics of the system. It delegitimizes democracy. At the same time, the capitalism regularly produces various crises of different kinds. Economic crises, boom and bust, but now particularly in our time that we're living on the planet, is environmental crises with all kinds of collateral resulting epidemiological crises and economic crises and economic problems. So it constantly generates crises that require big government intervention at the same time that it's delegitimizing and rendering inauthentic democratic promises from allegedly liberal politicians like Obama or Clinton or Biden, thereby opening the space for the fascist leaders who say, I alone can fix it. And those fascist leaders still need popular support from enough of the population to play their game and to pull off their power seizures, both through parliamentary and extra-parliamentary kinds of ways. So they do need to make certain populist kinds of outreaches, but under the rules of capitalism, that's not going to be to the proletarian majority. It's going to be around very revanchist, backward, reactionary kinds of sources of identity, like nationhood, palingenetic ultranationalism, make our country great again, patriarchy, an obsession with borders, and all of that kind of stuff. They play this game of divide and rule. Fascism is not anti-capitalist. Fascism actually upholds and worships private wealth. It's not going to attack them. So it's deeply invested in its own particular way in racial and ethnic and gender oppression and divide and rule. These are ultimately the types of things that we're going to have to confront if we want to make this problem go away. Then there's the international dimension, too, of the struggle between different, I think, capitalist states, which is constant fuel for the ultra-nationalist xenophobia that is the central part of fascism. Anybody on the Trump and left who thinks that Trump's not an imperialist or that this movement is an imperialist is just smoking something. They're just living in a dream world. Trump did more drone attacks in his 4 years than Obama did. He threatened war. He damn near provoked a full-on war with Iran. It's kind of amazing that he didn't. He's very serious about attacking our direct proximate southern neighbor, Mexico. And if he gets in, there will be military incursions in Mexico. He nuclear terrorized China and North Korea repeatedly. Let's not for a second pretend that Trump's not an imperialist. He's an ultra-militarist. He wants to fight wars. But the way to resist fascism is not just by trying to vote it out, particularly under the American system where we don't even have one person, one vote. That alone is massively inadequate voting, and dreaming about lawsuits and prosecutions as the answer is also monumentally inadequate. And who wouldn't want to see Trump locked up and thrown in jail? Of course, I want that. But these fall painfully and egregiously short of the kind of presence that we need to to defeat fascism, but also to create the presence in the streets, the presence in the public squares, the presence in the culture more broadly that we need in the streets and the public squares and the broader political culture, not just to defeat fascism, but to go further and create a new way of living and a new kind of society, which to me is socialism, that really does sweep fascism as a menace and as a threat into Karl Marx's proverbial dustbin of history. Because if we don't create a new type of society, it will constantly rear its head. Even the more liberal sections, I think, of the American ruling class have a kind of interest in it still hanging on and it's still being out there. Even while they don't want it to actually hold governing power, it's useful as a foil to have all these revanchist ideas out there and unfortunately empowered, because then you get to run against it. And then you get to see the whole system, even your party, the whole system tilts further to the right and more to the unmitigated advantage of capital.
I wonder what gives you hope in this moment. How do you keep going? Hear all this and feel like it's all destined to be just horror after horror, headed towards unspeakable horror.
In one level, it's almost like a spiritual thing. There's an existential sort of commitment to changing the world, whatever the odds are. I mean, I've said in a lot of my writing, it's not about the crystal ball. Let's say the chances of transformation are 2 in 10. Why in the hell bring them down to 0 in 10 by giving up in advance? This is sort of the radical left, the left-wing version of Pascal's bargain. You know, the medieval monk who said you lose nothing by believing in God, but you lose everything by not believing in God. So at one level, there's that just sort of existential commitment. I think secondarily, a really good way to retain hope is to actually participate in movements, even when they're small, because you really see it's extraordinary. I saw this when I was teaching too. I was always amazed at how there was always in a class a cadre. It wasn't as big as I wanted it to be. There was always 5 to 10 kids who really got it, who hung around and talked after the lectures and wanted to be part of movements, become part of movements, and you do see people undergo transformations. I was very inspired by my participation recently in the protest against Jason Aldean, the fascist country singer. A bunch of us, we weren't masses, but 25 of us, 30 of us, I don't know, went down to Tinley Park and protested, got right in the middle of these fascist faces that were all for this Klan song, you know, this lynch mob song. Try that in a small town. And there was some youth from the south side of Chicago, and just to see them go through that experience of actually confronting the right wing and the solidarity that they built. And you do see people transform in movements through their interactions with each other and through their confrontation with the state. There's also, I think, the way this paralysis is going on right now between the polarized parties and the populace is very historically interesting in terms of what it suggests about the possibility for real transformation. You often see this prior to moments of transformation. You see splits within the elite. And right now we have an epic split within the populace, but also within the elites, between those who are still clinging to what's left of what's called democracy, which I would call bourgeois democracy, but previously normative, you know, decades and decades of bourgeois parliamentary rule of law and electoral democracy of the type where when you lose an election, you go home. You honor the outcomes of elections. And then on the other hand, a whole wing of the elite and a significant tens of millions of people in the populace now have gone the other way, and they can't get anything done. That's very delegitimizing, I think, for people. And it's going to cause all kinds of problems. It's not going away anytime soon. And it's an opening, I think. It's an opening for a different pole, a different potential leadership to come to the fore to say, look, this polarization is the wrong polarization. We need to think about the polarization between the whole system at the elite level and everyone else, the underlying structural and institutional system that has given rise to this epic and now lethal dysfunction. And think about fundamental structural transformation in how we organize our society and our political lives. You know, if bourgeois democracy is fading, and I think this might be the case, I think we might be in late bourgeois democracy in this country, then we're going to need some other kind of intervention. And it's going to have to be a real kind of movement that actually would reflect the interests of the majority of the people in the country and in the world.
Thanks so much, Paul, for taking the time to chat with me, to share your insight, your perspective, your expertise, and of course, your time. It's always good to talk with you, especially in these dark times, to have someone to help us sift through this madness, if you will. We're going to put a link to your latest piece that's up on your Substack, and we encourage folks to go to paulstreet.substack.com to sign up, to subscribe, to stay connected to Paul and his writing and to engage with his work. Is there anything else, Paul, that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention, or other projects that you're working on that you wanted to let people know about?
My Substack is called the Paul Street Report, and I usually have a piece on every Monday and every Thursday, sometimes on a Friday. And occasionally I take my recorder over to the piano and write a crazy song. That's just for paid subscribers, though.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul.
You bet.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Got thoughts or questions off this episode? We want to hear them. Ideas for topics or guests you want to hear on the show? Yes, please send them to us. Have a skill you think could help? We want to know all about it. Reach out to me at the site previously known as Twitter. I'm at Sam B. Goldman. Drop me a line at SamanthaGoldman@refusefascism.org. Find us on Instagram, Mastodon, Threads, Blue Sky, some other thing probably that I don't know we're on, at Refuse Fascism on all those platformies. Or do one better and leave us a voicemail. We want to hear from you, and you might even hear yourself on a future episode. Find the link to our voicemail in the show notes. And if you want to support the show, it's super simple. The best way to show us some love is by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or your listening platform of choice. And of course, follow, subscribe, so you never miss an episode. You can also become a patron to support our pod and content creation, to help people understand and act to stop the fascist threat. You can give today at patreon.com/refusefascism or by visiting refusefascism.org and hitting the donate button. And you can make a one-time donation or a recurring gift. Thanks in advance for your support. And thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkelman for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers, we have transcripts available for each show. So be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. We'll be back next Sunday. Until then, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.